Every story begins somewhere, and the story of our faith begins way back in the Old Testament. The vintage faith of those such as Noah, Abraham, Daniel, David, and King Solomon is woven into our faith in Jesus today. And the timeless truths and transformative events found in the pages of the Old Testament go beyond classic stories. They are treasures that lead us to our Savior himself.
Hi. How's everybody doing? We having fun yet? Good. Who's in summer mode? Is anybody? Yes. Who's missing the snow? I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. I did that last year. I did that last service, and like 3 people almost rushed the stage. No, I'm just kidding. No, we are in full summer mode, and we actually just got back from vacation last night. So we went up to the mountains, which was awesome. That's why I kind of thought of the snow, because at one point it was really cold. And what's missing from this picture is like the 5 guys and ladies doing the polar bear plunge over in the right side of this. I did not do that. Although I have a bad case of FOMO sometimes. So I was like, ooh, should I? So next year. I think next year it's on my list. So come on if anybody else wants to try it. I'm trying to represent NorthPoint there a little bit, but yeah, it was just a ton of fun. It was great to be unplugged. We turned off phones. We were just away for the week, which was great because, when you're walking the hills, just kind of looking at God's creation. It's just kind of a cool reminder, right? We just kept talking about it, how when you see new parts of God's creation, it's just this reminder that, man, God's big and God can work in amazing ways, and he's a powerful God that sometimes we just need to be reminded of that. And a couple weeks ago, I talked about our new puppy. So we took our new puppy up to Colorado. So this is a picture of her living her best life. And so she's a golden retriever. She's turned 5 months last week, and she was every bit of a puppy, trying to tear me down a hill. So I almost died a few times because she just didn't know. We haven't gotten that walking sync yet. So, but her name is Kelton. She's having a ton of fun. And then I don't have a fail video like last week when Jeremy showed the geese video. I know who saw it because you guys were all laughing right now. But I did have this one. This was really cool. So this is on that same hike where I just showed you. This is our friend. So we travel with another family that we're really close with, and their youngest, I'm just going to call her, she's like the Snow White of the mountains, because wherever we go, she can seem to get all the animals near her. And so it's like she can charm rodents. So it's like the gophers will come, like the squirrels will come. Well, this is a marmot, and it was just like infatuated with her. And I'm worried because I think one day she's going to gather enough minions to take over the mountain. But right now she's super cute. And so not a fail video, but it's super cute. And so we had a great time. It was a ton of fun. We got back last night, so bear with me this morning. No, it should be a ton of fun. I'm really excited. Last week, Jeremy launched us into our new series called Vintage Faith, and I'm excited. I love the Old Testament. I love the Old Testament for 2 reasons. One is because it teaches us about who God is, and it teaches us about where our faith comes from. And I think so many times we kind of bypass the Old Testament to get to the good stuff, right? Like to get to Jesus, which I get it. That's great. But there's so much in the Old Testament that helps us understand the depth of what Jesus has done for us. And so what I'm hoping to do today as we dive in, that we might just learn a little bit more of how God sees us and a little bit more again of what Jesus did for us. So a little bit of background of where we're at. We're going to be in Exodus 19, which is on page 59 in the Bibles under your chairs if you want to turn there. But let me give you a little bit of background. So Genesis has happened, all 50 chapters, and there's a whole lot in those chapters, right? God has told Abraham that he's going to raise up a nation, and that nation starts developing. So by the end of Genesis, God is already saving that nation from a famine by taking them to Egypt. But things don't exactly go as everybody likes them to, and so they stay an extra 400 years, and they become slaves in Egypt, because Egyptians basically see them as being kind of a force to be reckoned with, and so they make them slaves. So for 430 years, Israel is in Egypt, and then Exodus starts. And you've probably heard of a guy named Moses. Familiar? Everybody heard of him? Okay. So Moses comes up, and God uses Moses to take Israel out of Egypt. And where we find ourselves today in Exodus 19 is one of my favorite passages, because I think it teaches us something that we easily forget, and I hope just for a few minutes today I can remind us of how God sees us because it's how God has seen his people all throughout. So God takes his people out of Egypt. He takes them to this place called Mount Sinai. And when they get there, he's about to give them those things called the 10 Commandments, if those are familiar. He's about to give them the 10 Commandments, and he's going to teach them what it means. But if I could pause real quick, I just want to give a little bit of framework. Okay, we talked about this a little bit last week with how to read the Bible. And if you were here, you saw that video of Tim Keller kind of reminding us that the Bible, we can either put two things as the main focus of the Bible, right? We can either put ourselves or we can put Jesus. And so I think a key question whenever we read Scripture is to ask ourselves, what are you telling us about you, God, not what are you saying to me? Because as soon as I ask the question, what are you saying to me, I just made the Bible about me. But when I keep asking the question, God, what are you saying about you, then I keep looking at what God is showing about himself. Now, if I can give you another lens to look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament is really interesting because we see God adopting his nation. God, he's told us he's going to build this nation of Israel, and he's going to make them an example of how to relate to the whole world, right? Like, he's going to show the world how to relate to people through this nation of Israel. Here's what's interesting, though, is Israel hasn't learned how to be a nation yet. And so when God pulls them out of Egypt, they've been surrounded by different faiths. They've been surrounded by different cultures. And so what God is going to do throughout the whole Old Testament is he's going to develop them as a people. It's kind of like parenting, to be honest. Like when you parent, you start with a little baby infant that is totally dependent and that needs everything, right? And then they start growing up and you get the terrible twos. And then you get the early elementary and the late elementary, right? And then you turn 10 and you're in double digits until 100, right? And then you get to the teenage years, which that's like the terrible twos again, but with a louder voice and bigger decisions, right? But if you look, the Old Testament is a lot like God coaching his kids. A lot like we have to be coached. Right? Like at some point, we all probably had to learn how to not chew with our mouth open all the time. Am I right? That's a good thing to learn. It makes you a little bit more civilized. You can go out to eat a little bit more and nobody gets grossed out. But some people we have to learn that as a kid. Someone has to teach us. And just like as parents, when we parent kids and help grow them up, that's what God's doing with his kids. That's what God's doing with the nation. And at times you have to give stuff up. And other times you might have to adopt new things because that's how we grow, right? My daughter, Elsa, which I don't think she's not in here. She's helping out in Kidsman. And I usually ask permission before I share stories. I didn't do that, so let's just keep this between you and I. Sound good? Got me? Okay. So when she was like 3, she loved her pacifier. Do you know what I'm talking about? Those things that you pop in kids' mouth to make them stop crying, to soothe them, right? And so she loved it. She had it all the time. So it got to be about late 2s, early 3s, and we're like, I think it's time to put the pacifier away. But guess what? If we took them all, then she was like devastated, and it was lots of crying, and we had no clue. I'm just kidding, no. But just saying real quick, I think this is funny because I think every family has a different name for the pacifier. So just real quick, what did you call your pacifier on the count of 3? 1, 2, 3. See? Okay, my favorite is I have a friend who called it the fuss plug. Which I'm like, that is hilarious. But like Binky, Passy, all those things. So it got to be about the age of 3, and we're like, it's time to help Elsa put away the pacifier. So what we did is we were living in Singapore, and Singapore had this amazing zoo. And when you walked in about 100 yards into the zoo, over your head was this incredible orangutan-like park. So it was like they were free-ranging, which was hilarious because they would pick on kids because they would throw stuff at kids. They were hilarious. So what we decided is we started talking to Elsa, and we said, hey, Elsa, you know what? The orangutans, they need some pacifiers. And she was like, what? Like, yeah, the baby orangutans, they don't have any pacifiers, and they need some. So what do you think if you packed up all your pacifiers, the next time we went to the zoo, we gave it to the baby orangutans? And she was like, yeah, that's a great idea. So what we did is we packed up all of our pacifiers. We had them in this little plastic box, except for one, which she kept in. And we go to the zoo, and we got to the zoo, and we're hanging out, watching the orangutans, and I was like, well, let's find a zookeeper, and we'll give him pacifier. She's like, okay. So I went around the corner, found this zookeeper, and I was like, hey, can you help me out? And he's like, sure. And he had no clue what I was about to ask, I guarantee you that. And I'm like, so, my daughter has some pacifiers, and she'd like to give them to the baby orangutans. And he was immediately like, they don't need any pacifiers. I was like, no, I know. I get it. But can you come around the corner, take the pacifiers, and just say, the baby orangutans will love these, but you might not ever see them because the baby orangutans hang out in the back, and they're not out here in public. So then she never sees them again, right? So he was like, sure, I'll do that. So he came around. This is my favorite part. He was amazing because he came around. He was like, hey. And Elsa basically, in her like limited words, would say, baby orangutan, passy. And he was like, yeah. So she handed over the plastic box. And then my favorite is she's like, put it right in his hand. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, dude, I owe you such a big tip right now. And so then she was like, well, thank you. The baby orangutans are going to love these. And so we walked this way and we got on some tram, and he walked about 10 feet this way and was like right in the trash can. And you could see him doing this a little bit. I was like, thank you. But she had to put that away. Much like you and I have to grow up sometimes, right? We have to put things away and we have to learn new steps. And that's honestly what God is doing with Israel. When he calls them out of Egypt, they've been surrounded by so many things. He's going to have to teach them how to be a nation. And he does that through the 10 Commandments. He does that through the next 18 chapters when he gives them their national code and all the little intricacies of what it means to build their tabernacle. And that's what he's doing. But he starts out with this. And this is one of my favorite passages because it reminds us of three things that I want to highlight today. So it says, this is Exodus 19, verse 1. On the first day of the third month, after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you out on the eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. So God has rescued his people. He's brought them to one place, and he's kind of changed their status. No longer are they going to be known as slaves. Now they're going to be known for something totally different. And what he's doing is he's pursuing his people. And I think one thing that's true that you'll always recognize throughout the whole Old Testament and even clearer in the New is this. God will always move toward people. That's why he created us. He created us to be in relationship. He created us to be close. He created us to be near. And the thing that we'll always notice in the Old Testament, every single step of the way, no matter how much people try to mess it up, God will always move towards his people. And this is how he does it. The first thing he says is he calls his people something that I think is kind of interesting to hear. Do you notice the first thing he says? He says, if you do all my things, like all these things, if you keep my covenant, which, by the way, for the fact that God would choose to make a covenant with people is a really interesting concept. Something he would never have to do. He's God. He doesn't have to make a commitment to anybody. And here's the deal. Covenants, we don't really fully understand, do we? There's only one form of covenant that we really talk about to this day, and that's in marriage. We talk about marriage being a covenant. Every other part of life that you and I are used to, we're used to contracts, which are very, very different. Because contracts, you and I can both sign, we can agree, but then guess what? A few years later, one of us can get tired, we cancel the contract, maybe pay a fine, do something, we can get out of that, right? Not true with covenants. Covenants is a whole other cultural understanding. When you enter into a covenant, you don't leave. It's like the handshake that never stops, because no one walks away from a covenant. And so when God looks and says, I'm going to make a covenant with you because I'm going to adopt you as my nation, what he's doing something that no one else would ever have to. No other God is ever known for doing this. And then he calls them this. He calls them three things in this passage that I absolutely love. The first thing is God calls his people a treasured possession. Isn't that interesting? That God looks at his people and says, you're my treasured possession. Whenever I look at you, it puts a smile on my face because I enjoy you. I delight in you. Think about this just for a second. At the time when this was written, this would have been so countercultural to how anyone understood a deity. Because where Israel was right in the middle of two large kingdoms. Up north was ancient Mesopotamia, called the birthplace of modern civilization, or also later became Babylon. Down south was Egypt. Both those places had very, very different faith understandings. Both those places had a couple key characteristics. One, there was a god or many gods, as many as millions of gods. And the other thing is every single one of their creation stories had to do with God creating or God's creating in order for people to serve them. God's story is a little bit different, isn't it? God created his people to be in relationship with him. In ancient Egypt, if you wanted to have a good life, guess what you did? You appeased your gods. In Babylon, if you wanted to have a good life, what did you do? You appeased your gods. You did everything that you had to do in order for God to be okay with you. And when life was bad, that means you made God mad. And when life was good, then you must have been appeasing God pretty well. That was the understanding. That was how people walked with God. Here's something interesting. This is kind of crazy because it even goes further for Egypt. Because in Egypt, even your afterlife had to do with how you dealt with God. So like in your afterlife, here's what you did. You trusted that your family would still take care of your tomb or of your statue or of whatever represented you in order for you to have a good life in afterlife. Isn't that wild? So here's an interesting thing. You know what a sphinx is, right? You know those cat things with the heads, right? And there's also a lot of other different statues in ancient Egypt. You know what they represented? They represented people for their afterlife. So if you wanted someone to have a good afterlife, what'd you do? You kept their statue clean. You kept it ready so that they could be fully physical fit in their afterlife. But if you didn't like them, guess what you did? You broke off their ears, or you broke off their nose. Why? Because if you broke off their nose, guess what? They can't smell in the afterlife. If you break off their ears, now they can't hear in their afterlife. If you gouge out their eyes, they no longer can see. That's why a lot of statues come to us today broken, because someone was mad at them and wanted to give them a horrible afterlife. Isn't that crazy? Think about that concept with God. Their whole understanding with God was, if I make God happy, I have a good life. And God of Israel comes and says, hey, I see you as my treasured possession. I see you as a people to be delighted in, that I'm happy to walk with, that I'm going to do life with, and I'm actually going to teach you what it means to be a nation. I'm not going to make you guess. I'm going to give you the 10 Commandments in order that you might understand how to relate to me. I'm not going to make you guess your way through it. You ever played a game that you don't know the rules to? That's horrible, right? But God starts giving them commands in order to teach them what it means to be his nation, so that they would know what it meant to be his treasured possession. Next thing he calls them is this, and I could spend probably 2 weeks on this alone, but I promise I won't do that to you. I'll get you out before lunch. But he says this, you are to me a kingdom of priests. Do you know what a kingdom means? If you break it down, it's a space, right? It's an authority word. A kingdom is a space for the king's dominion, right? That's where his authority is. So he says, I'm going to give you place and you're going to have authority again. You know what this is going back to? It's going back to Genesis 1 and 2. When God created Adam and Eve and put them in a garden and he said, I want you to rule over this garden. What he's telling his people right here is you're going to rule over an area again. And we're going to do it together. We're going to do it in partnership. It's going to be a kingdom, and you're going to be to me a kingdom of priests. You know what priests do? Priests are the mediator between God and man. So what he's telling them is, guess what? My presence is going to be with you. And as we do life together, as my presence is with you, you're going to show the world what it looks like for us to be in relationship together. That's how you're going to bless the entire world. Isn't that crazy? He calls Israel to be the ones that his presence is going to walk with, his presence is going to be with. Can I pause right here and say, guess what? The same is still true today, and even more so than it was for them back then. We are still a kingdom of priests, and our job is to help people understand what it means to steward God's presence, just like they were back then. Okay, one of the most, I will argue, maybe not argue, I'll suggest, how about we go suggest? There we go. I'll suggest probably one of the least read books in the Old Testament is the book of Leviticus. Okay? If you've read it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The book of Leviticus has ended a lot of read the Bible through the year plans. Okay? You get to the book of Leviticus and you're like, why do I need to know what to do with mold in my hut? Like, I don't understand. Here's what the book of Leviticus is for, which makes it one of my most favorite books, because I'm weird and I like to nerd out like that. But here's the deal. The book of Leviticus was for Israel's priests to help them understand what it meant to steward God's presence for the whole people to enjoy it. Isn't that interesting? And it got so technical that they were talking about mold in houses, and they were talking about all these little intricacies. Why? Because it helped Israel grow up as a nation and learn what it meant to be unified and work together. But it taught the priests what it meant to steward God's presence. Guess what? With Jesus, and what he did on the cross, God's presence is no longer trapped or secluded, maybe is a better word, in the Holy of Holies. God's presence is out. His presence is actually in you and me, right? The Holy Spirit says it very clearly. When you come to know Jesus, the Holy Spirit indwells us. So you know what? Even more so today than back then, our job is a kingdom of priests, where you and I get to steward God's presence. Think about that just for a minute. Did you know that in every situation, in any moment, you can steward God's presence? You ever have one of those big family arguments that you need help in? Guess what? We can be the person that stewards God's presence in that moment and say, hey, well, let's pause for a minute. Let's look at God's grace. Let's find God's help in this space. You and I can do that, but guess what? If you're like me, we forget about it all the time, right? It's not the first thing that comes to mind. Just like the first thing that doesn't come to mind usually is that word God's treasured possession. There's a whole lot of other things that take control, right? The last thing that God says to his people is this: you'll be for me a holy nation, which is incredible. Holiness means a whole lot of things. One of the things it means to be set apart for something special. It also means to be fully whole, to be complete. And God says, you're going to be a holy nation. But let me pause right there. It's not because of what they do. Let's just be clear. Because the rest of the whole Old Testament's going to show us how much they screw up, right? Because they didn't get it. Just like we don't get it today, let's be honest, right? You know why they're a holy nation? It's because God's presence was with them. That's what's going to make them a holy nation. That's why when Jesus comes and does exactly what he does for us, when he comes and lives the sinless life, dies on the cross, raises again and conquers death, that's why he makes every one of these things even more true than they were back then. Because through Jesus, you and I are treasured possessions. Through Jesus, you and I are a kingdom of priests. Through Jesus, you and I are a holy nation. Isn't that an incredible thing? And here, I'm not making that up. Let me tell you. So Jesus' disciple, his name's Peter, he wrote 2 letters. And one of the letters was to this church, and he wanted to make sure that they were reminded of this. And this is what he says in chapter 2. And see if this sounds familiar to what we just read. You ready? So this is now later in the New Testament. It's 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. See if you can recognize what we just talked about right here. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Does that sound familiar? Yeah? Isn't that incredible? So when God adopts his people and he changes their status from slave to treasures, what happens is later, fast forward, another 1,500 years, Peter reminds us, hey, just so you know, that's still true to this day. That through Jesus, you are a treasured possession. That through Jesus, you are a kingdom of priests. That through Jesus, you are a holy nation. Now let me pause here because I think we need to clarify. He's not talking to us as individuals, okay? I am not God's special possession and better than anyone else in this room. That's not what he's talking about. And I think sometimes we have to be reminded of this because we've been so individualized in how we understand God that we forget that everything that he's talking about right now is the big C church. So when he says that we are God's special possession or treasured possession, you know what he's saying? He's saying the big C church. Anyone who comes to know Jesus and walks with Jesus, we are his treasured possession. It's not me above, it's not you above anybody, it's not that church better than this. No. That's not what it means to know that we are treasured possession. It means to know that right now, you and I, in this church, along with everybody else around the world that is gathering in the next few hours, depending on the time zone, that we are God's treasured possession. And man, if we rest in that, doesn't that change perspective a little bit? Like, not to be like flaunted. Not to be like, oh, I'm better than you, or not to be like, you get something new and then you drive it, like you get the new car and you drive it around town to make sure everybody sees it. No. It's not to be flaunted. You know what it's supposed to be? It's supposed to be so for us to rest in. It's supposed to be so that we can enter any situation and say, guess what? I know that God has my back right now. I know that God's with me. I know that the God of creation wants to see us thrive. I know the God of creation wants to pursue me in such a way that he wants to be in relationship with us. Man, that'll change your perspective on a day, won't it? There's still something that gets in the way here, though, isn't it? And I still get caught up on that holy nation thing. And sometimes I feel like we still come to the place where we realize that we mess up a lot. And I think what happens is it changes how we see God or how we think God sees us. See, I think you and I probably have a different understanding of how God sees us. I'm going to read something to you. There's this book. It's called The Smell of Sin, which is really interesting because he goes through about 8 different stories. A couple that I would love to read, but it's probably better in a small group setting where you can unpack them. But there's one that gives us a kind of a challenging thing where I think this is how we go to when how we see how God relates to us sometimes. And I hope we can challenge it just a little bit. So this is what he says. He says, for many of us, Don Everett is the author, just to give him credit. This is not mine. I'm reading a page from his book. For many of us, sin smells more like a classroom, a grade school classroom. You know the smells: freshly cleaned linen floors, chalk dust, and when you're old enough, that faint smell of formaldehyde wafting in from the biology lab. Straight rows of predictable desks, a rectangular chalkboard up front, and a bank of bright, inviting windows on one side. And most of all, you know, she's always somewhere in the room, the teacher. Sometimes she sits on her throne behind her impressive wooden desk, eyeing the class. From up there, she can take in the whole classroom without even turning her head. No blind spots to speak of. She knows all, she sees all, she is the teacher. The teacher had the authority to set the rules before you ever came into the classroom. Looming over the chalkboard as an ever-present reminder is a laminated poster listing the rules. And you've always got that nagging feeling that she could change any of those rules without notice. Because, well, she is the teacher after all. As ominous as her level-gazed perch behind her desk can be, it is nothing compared to the stroll. Sure, it seems innocent enough. She's walking casually between the tight rows of desks, hands clasped behind her back, but looks can be deceiving. When she's behind her desk, you know where she is. But on the stroll, she could be coming up the right side or circling around the left, and you know you aren't supposed to look around to find out. No wondering eyes. She could be clear across the room looking out the window, or for all you know, standing right behind you, staring at your sweaty, shaking hand as it tries to copy correctly the spelling words. And if you do transgress one of the laminated rules and she finds out, which she always does, you will be punished. Punished. You are naughty, and the teacher is not happy. Have you ever done life where you just wonder if God's trying to catch you messing up? And then what happens there? We play down this thing. God just caught us messing up. So now, we would never say it this way, but this is the way we feel, right? God caught us messing up, so guess what? We're going to have a horrible day. Or, God, I did something good, maybe I'll have a good day now, right? Here's the deal. Whenever we think that way, guess what happens? We just put ourselves 4,000 years ago back in Egypt or Babylon, because that's exactly how they saw their gods. If you did the right thing, you did okay. If you did the wrong thing, you might have a bad day or a bad week or a bad month or a bad crop or whatever it is. And every time you and I live in that truth, we're putting ourselves in a total different faith. Because what is God telling us? God's telling us that we're his treasured possession. God's telling us that we're a kingdom of priests where his presence is right next to us. God's telling us that we're a holy nation because in Jesus we're forgiven and we are redeemed. And sometimes I think, I don't think it's totally found in sinning less, but instead it's pursuing all that Jesus has for us. You know, if God had if I gave one characteristic of God that I absolutely love, and this isn't all of them, we could spend years talking about all of God's characteristics, but if there was one that I think we forget about is God is always inviting. He's always inviting us to get closer. He's always inviting us to bring us more into his life, or bring him more into our lives. He's always inviting us to depend on him. But too many times I think you and I look at God and we think that God is ready to punish us, when really it looks more like God is ready to delight in us. There's this passage that if you've heard me pray this 100 times. It's a passage I love and I will always pray it. And if you hear me continue praying it, repeat it, I'm unabashed because it reminds me of this perspective of God. And it's in James. It's early in James. It's in James 1. It says this: if anyone lacks wisdom, come to God, and God will give to all without finding fault. Which is really like God saying this. You ready? No matter what you ask, he's never going to look and say, again? Parents, have you ever looked at your kid and said, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times? Have you ever had that exasperation thing with your kids where they're asking that same question that you've answered 50 more times and you get so frustrated? Guess what? It's not how God looks at us. Sometimes we think it's how God looks at us, but it's not. If any of you lacks wisdom, you can come to me and I will give to all without finding fault. God's going to look at us and God's going to look back and say, let's go on the journey together. You need help in this? Absolutely. That's what I'm here for. See, he's not like a teacher ready to catch you. He's more like a parent ready to delight in you. And I just wonder, what does that look like for this coming week? What does that look like in any given situation when we can walk into a room and say, I know that right now I have a God who delights in me. I know I have a God who's close. I know I have a God who's inviting me into this situation, and a God who is giving me his presence that I can even welcome him into this place. I wonder what that does for our conversations. I wonder what that does to our families, to our friends. I wonder what that does to even our own prayer life when we can look at God and say, God, thanks for being near us. And not ready to spank or swat or to condemn, but ready to delight in us.